that was so Hollywood, right, to have that be the case, whereas in real life, Hello, thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Arthur, the dog that crossed the jungle to find a home by Mikel Lindnord, published in 2016, and I'm comparing it with the movie Arthur the King, which was released in 2024. And this is the true story of an adventure racer who bonds with a stray dog that he comes across while racing. And I'm going to begin with my spoiler-free book and movie review, and this also will be broken up into the chapters down below, so if you want to hop around, you are more than welcome to. But I'm going to begin with my spoiler-free thoughts, beginning with the book. To be honest, this book was just okay. It wasn't as touching or engaging or exciting or sweet or as emotional or as inspirational as I had hoped it would be. And I feel like I'm the target audience for a book like this because I love nonfiction, I love endurance sports, I love dogs, and so I was very excited to read this book. And while I do like the story itself, I do think it is a really cool story, I just don't think there was anything about this book that would make me recommend it to someone over having them just search online to find an article and read the article instead. Of course, he expounds upon different aspects of the story here, but there just wasn't anything extra he says that I found compelling enough to recommend this book to people. And then also while he talks about adventure racing, which by the way, adventure racing, so you're part of a team, and in order to get to the finish line, you have to like bike, run, kayak, ski, like depending on the location, they happen at different areas all around the world. So depending on the location, like you're doing all sorts of different endurance sports imaginable in order to get to the finish line. And it lasts days. So it is a very intense race to participate in. But while he is talking to us about this, we read, you have to be very fit, not just sprint fit so you can run or bike fast when the going's easy, not just upper body fit so you can drag yourself across ravines on ropes or paddle through rapids, but also mentally fit and strong to withstand the sleep deprivation and the 100 other pains and discomforts that go with doing adventure sports in grueling environments for days on end. It's not everybody's cup of tea. In fact, I would say that normal people, and most people are normal people, cannot even understand what motivates us to put ourselves through such an extreme form of, well, normal people would say torture. And on multiple occasions, he talks about what normal people must think of adventure racing. And that's what annoys me with the section I just read. Like, don't try to guess what normal people think of this sport that you love. Like, I don't care what normal people think, right? Like, I just want to hear what you, the writer, thinks of this sport and why it attracts you, which he does get into that. But again, multiple times, he's like, normal people probably think I'm crazy, and normal people would call this torture, but I love it. And like normal people, like stop talking about normal people. Like something about that just really bothered me. And as of the time I'm recording this audiobook is free on Audible. So if you're in a situation where you need something to listen to and you have not prepared anything and you're just like, crap, I need something quick, then I would say go ahead and download this for free on Audible and listen to it. But if you're not in a dire circumstance in desperate need of an audiobook, then I would say this honestly isn't worth the time or money. And I know that sounds very harsh, and it's not like I hated this book. I gave it 2 stars on Goodreads, but it was just very meh, I guess you could say. And my complaint also isn't with the fact that he is not like a professional writer, right? He is someone who's just thrust into the limelight, and because he was part of something that made him famous, he decided to write a book about it, you know? And I have read other books like this as well, where you can clearly tell that this person is not a writer, but that's fine. Like, I don't need like these elegant prose or anything. I just want something that feels open and vulnerable and honest and giving us the details that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten. And we just didn't really get that here. And yeah, so I wouldn't recommend the book. I feel like you can just find an article online that will tell you everything you need to know, or you could just watch this video. And I feel like that would also suffice. And on to the movie review. I did enjoy this movie well enough. There are some like truly suspenseful scenes in regards to the racing going on, which I did really like. And then I did enjoy the scenes between Mark Wahlberg and the dog. And yet having said that, like this isn't one that I would tell people like, you have to go see this in theaters. Like if you want to wait for streaming, I wouldn't argue with you. Like I think that's fine to just wait to watch this at home. And yet having said that, if you want to go see this in theaters, I wouldn't discourage that either. You know, I like promoting movies that are not these like action-packed CGI-filled superhero movies. Like I want more movies like this to be made. Maybe not exactly like this, but some of these movies that are just about normal people, you know, without a bunch of CGI, without a bunch of action scenes. Like I like like movies like this for the most part. And so I'm all about supporting movies that are not superhero movies. So if you're gonna go see this in theaters, I wouldn't discourage you from it. Like, it's not a waste of time to watch this movie. And I want to start out with kind of a pet peeve I had about this movie, and it is not spoilery, so I'm going to just talk about it here. And that is the fact that they use inaccurate dates and locations for this movie. And, it starts out saying based on a true story. And I know movies based on a true story take a lot of liberty. So my complaints isn't that like, oh, it didn't follow the truth, detail for detail. Like, that's fine. I expect differences. But why include the year that these things take place when it's not the real year it took place? And by including a year, you're leading the audience to believe that this is the real year it happened. And so the movie just did not need to include a year. That makes no difference to the story. So why include the year this happened when it's not even going to be the correct year? Because this race took place in 2014 when he found Arthur. But the movie has it take place like much more recently, which is fine. But why include the date at all? I know that's so minor, but something about it just really bothered me. And this movie also has the race take place in the Dominican Republic, whereas in real life, the race took place in Ecuador. I'm not really sure what their reasoning was for changing the location on that. I feel like they could have filmed it in the Dominican Republic, but just called it Ecuador just to be accurate. And again, that's a minor complaint, so I don't even know how much that really matters. But yeah, in the real life, this took place in Ecuador. And then also, Mikael is Swedish. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I listened to part of this book on audio, and yeah, they pronounced it like, I think it was like Mikael in the audiobook. So anyway, he is from Sweden, whereas of course the movie Mark Wahlberg is in that role, and so he is American, which that's a change I, fully expected. Yeah, I think my biggest gripe is probably with the year, the fact that they include these dates. Like, why include the dates? The movie doesn't even need it. You could have just left that out. So again, I know that's such a minor critique, but it was something that was bugging me. But from here on out, I'm going to be getting into the details of the plot, which means we will have spoilers going forward. So beginning with Michael and his team. So in the movie, we see that Michael is on hard times. We see that he had an adventure race 3 years prior, but due to his pride, and he is the team leader, and due to his pride, they made bad choices and their team didn't even finish the race. And he hasn't raced since then. And he's struggling enough financially that he is having to go work for his dad, which he finds very demeaning. And I say he's like struggling. I don't know how much they're struggling financially though, because they have an incredible house with a fantastic view in Colorado. So I don't know if his wife is just rich or what. He does say later how he used his own money to fund the race, which is not based in the real story. This is exclusive to the movie. So yeah, so maybe his wife is rich and that's why they have such a nice home. But regardless, whether or not they are struggling financially, he is definitely struggling emotionally. He is a racer who has not raced in 3 years and he's just feeling very discouraged. But he finally decides that he is going to attempt to run the next upcoming adventure race. And so he is reaching out to people to try to sponsor his team, and he is reaching out to people to be on his team. And so we see him like passionately talk to this company that he wants for a sponsorship. And we see him talk to each of these 3 team members that he recruits. And we see like how they're all underdogs in one way or another. And so we see what drives them to be part of this race and what it means to them and just why it's important to them. And none of this is in the book. None of this was in the true story. So Mikael wasn't on like hard times and he'd been racing regularly. So it wasn't like this big deal of like, oh, he didn't finish a race and now he's going to get back into it. And we also don't hear much about his teammates. Like he briefly touches on like who they are and where they're from kind of a thing, but we don't get any details that tell us why this race means something to these individual people. Like, yeah, Mikael shares why he loves adventure racing and why making it on the podium would be like the best thing in the world to happen to him. But yeah, as far as his teammates and, having it be this big moment for him to find sponsorships. And yeah, the movie just built that up much more. It also made you more emotionally invested too by knowing these details in his life as well as his team members' lives. And to talk about the race, so during the race in the movie, Michael's navigator has them take multiple shortcuts. And so these shortcuts prove to be very difficult. However, they cut down so much on the mileage that it definitely helps his team make a lot of progress. And there is one shortcut that leads them to a zip line, and 2 guys cross the zip line fine. However, when the woman crosses, she gets stuck part way. And so Michael has to go out onto the zip line and rescue her. And man, this scene was so stressful. I was on the edge of my seat. It was very suspenseful, but I just also felt so much anxiety watching this scene. So it's very well done. But yes, so stressful to watch. And then we also get another team member who is severely dehydrated, and so he ends up needing an IV. And if you require an IV due to dehydration, you get docked 4 hours. However, Michael in the movie, he's like, you know what? That's fine. Like, one, we need you at the top of your game, so you need this IV. And two, all of us will then benefit from a 4-hour rest. And at this point in the movie, they are number one in the lead. So they're like, you know what? We're hours ahead of the next team, so we have the time to rest. And then when we get back to it, we'll all be energized and fully refreshed and ready to tackle the next leg of this. And yeah, the only aspect of this that was in the true story is the fact that people needed IVs, and they had a lot of setbacks in the book. So they had like multiple 4-hour rests that were mandatory for them to take, and they were never in the lead. And I don't think they were ever like speculated to win by any means. And also the race depictions in the book, like they just weren't exciting or suspenseful. Whereas, yeah, like I said, there's scenes in the movie that, yeah, you just feel that excitement and that suspense and the stress like I was talking about. And in the book, I just wasn't very invested in the race itself, and it wasn't described in a very interesting way in my mind. And yeah, in the end of the movie, they come in second overall, and they would have been first, except in the kayaking section, Arthur, they turned back to go get him. And so this causes them to come in second, when otherwise, if they hadn't gotten Arthur, they would have been first. And this again is not true to real life at all. His team came in 12th place, but of this, he says in the book, we had made navigation mistakes, we'd had penalties, we hadn't made as much progress as we should have done on a number of early stages. By the time we'd gotten to the TA where we met Arthur, we had lost 6 hours more than we should have done. Normally, I would be going over and over each stage of what happened. Normally, I would already be analyzing where we could have made better time or made fewer mistakes. But this wasn't normally, I realized, as I found myself starting to think instead that if we hadn't lost those 6 hours, then I never would have met Arthur. Perhaps these things happen for a reason. And I guess I should talk about Arthur. So they first see him at one of the transition areas, which is what a TA is. And Michael/Mikhail, he gives him some food, but then from there, he just, continues on his way. However, later on throughout the course, he comes across the dog yet again. And he's like, what? Like, that's that dog from earlier. And Arthur just starts following him in his group. And there's a point where Arthur, obviously, he's this street dog who has these wounds, and he's obviously very hungry. And so at one point, Mikhail convinces all of his team members to give Arthur their portion of meatballs. And food is very scarce during a race, so this is a big deal that they all contribute their food to Arthur. And this is when they give him the name Arthur, because he puts the meatballs on this like huge leaf, and he's like, oh, it's a meal fit for a king. And he names him Arthur after King Arthur. And we get a similar scene in the movie where Mark Wahlberg, he sees Arthur just sitting there so patiently, even when a guy is eating meatballs. And he's like, wow, like he's not even begging or anything. He's just sitting there like so regal and patient, just like a king. And so then he puts some meatballs on a leaf, and he's like, a meal for King Arthur, essentially. And so that's how he gets his name in both book and movie. In the book, the scene felt there was more ceremony to it, the fact that each member sacrificed their food for Arthur. Whereas in the movie, like we have the guy who's dehydrated, and he does give Arthur a meatball, which is a big deal because he's kind of not as into the dog as Mark Wahlberg is. But yeah, for the most part, this scene is very similar in book and movie. And yeah, Arthur, he sticks by their side throughout the course of the race until they get to the kayak portion. They are told they cannot bring Arthur into the kayak. And so Michael is very sad, but he, gets in the kayak and leaves. But then Arthur jumps into the water and starts swimming along beside them. And in the book, he knows that Arthur isn't the greatest swimmer. And so eventually he gives in and he picks Arthur up and brings him into the kayak. And in the book we read, I found myself talking to myself in the way I usually only do if I'm in real danger. This is it, I told myself. This is it. If you do this, it's for good. No matter how damaged he is, how sick, he will be yours and your responsibility. You can't ever push him away from you. You must love him. You and he will always be together if you do this. It's for good. And so he tells his teammate to stop paddling, and he gets Arthur in the kayak with him. And Arthur, he's like a medium-sized dog. He's probably like 40 pounds. So this is like a considerable weight to have in the kayak with you. And this does happen in the movie as well. It's a very similar scene where they're told they can't have him in the kayak. In the movie, it's a bit more dramatic, where it's like Arthur is about to drown when Mark Wahlberg like reaches down in to get him. And he's with the teammate Leo, who hasn't been crazy about Arthur and he definitely wants to win. And yet in this moment, Leo is like, no, like Arthur, he's one of us. And so he's on board to turn around and save him. And in real life, getting Ecuador to give permission to Mikkel to take Arthur out of the country was quite an ordeal. And also to get Sweden to approve to bring Arthur in was also quite the process. And the movie touches on this to some extent. They don't really get into all of the details of how difficult this was. And also in the book, because Arthur was making the news, so a lot of people were, seeing in the news that this adventure team had taken on a fifth member of this local dog. And so he was kind of famous. And so there were Ecuadorians who were claiming that Arthur was theirs and they were lying. But yeah, this was just one of the many setbacks that they had when trying to get Arthur out of the country and into Sweden. And Arthur also had, again, just a lot of wounds and injuries and parasites, and then his teeth were in horrible condition, so there was a lot of vet care that he needed. And when he gets to Sweden, he also needs to be quarantined for 4 months, and being in quarantine also kind of negatively impacts his ability to get the vet care that he needs. But long story short, ultimately, both governments allowed Arthur in, and he was able to get the vet care he needed, and he was able to go live with Mikkel in Sweden. And Arthur did pass away in 2020 from a tumor, so Mikkel was able to give him about like 6 years of a very good life, at least before he died. And in the movie, there are multiple scenes after the race where it seems like Arthur might die, either because they need to put him down or, he's just not doing well. But again, as in real life, Arthur does survive, and we see him happily running with Mark Wahlberg in the end of the movie. And also something the movie kind of shows, like we see Arthur howling and they at the vet, and so they run out and they're like, Michael, we need you, come in here. And so Michael goes in to see Arthur, and then Arthur like calms down once Michael is there. And this is something we got more into the book, where Arthur had like severe separation anxiety from Mikkel, because he got so attached to him. So whenever he wasn't around, Arthur would like howl as if he was in severe pain. But then once Mikkel showed up, he would calm down. And so that was a difficulty, because he would go to work out and his wife would be like, you have to come back. He is howling like crazy. It sounds like he's in pain. Like, please come back here. And this happens at the vet as well, where they're taking care of him and they're like, Michael, we need your help. And then he goes back there and he thinks something like Arthur is dying, but turns out he just had severe anxiety without Mikkel. But then I also wanted to talk about the Arthur Foundation. So Lynn Nord had started something called the Arthur Foundation in order to help stray dogs in other countries, because in Ecuador, for example, people could abuse animals and there was no punishment for it. So like it wasn't illegal. But thanks to the Arthur Foundation, they had passed a law of animal welfare, which now makes it illegal to abuse a dog. And this is an interesting aspect of the true story that I just find really thought-provoking, and I feel like this alone could spark so many interesting conversations to have with people and so many interesting debates. Because on one hand, I love animals. I have dogs that I absolutely love so much, and I'm not for the abuse of animals, of course. Also, Mikkel, he got a lot of backlash because he's like some guy from a very wealthy country coming into another country telling them what they're doing wrong and telling them they need to change. And it's not like he's committed to this country and like moving there and living there and wanting to make a difference. No, he showed up for some race for 10 days and then he went back home. And now while he's living in Sweden, he's telling these people they need to change their ways. And yeah, I do feel conflicted about it again, because I feel like there's other ways you could help the people of Ecuador. It's not a third world country, but compared to Sweden is a very wealthy country, So compared to that, Ecuador definitely is not as well off. And I know stray dogs are a huge problem because they have rabies and other diseases. So it is something that needs to be gotten under control in order to help the people. Again, I'm not saying he's wrong for starting this foundation, but I just think this is a more complicated issue. And also another thing about this book, there's a part where someone else is taking care of Arthur, like one of the vets or someone, and he is a fair-skinned person, and he says to Mikkel, I think because I am tall and fair like you, he feels that I must be a good guy and will help him. I liked that. I liked the idea that Arthur had a vision of what a good guy looked like, and that guy looked like me. In this too, I feel like the book didn't need this line because it kind of comes across as borderline racist. The fact that Arthur sees a good guy as being someone who is white, essentially. And so that too, I'm like, you didn't need to include that. But when it comes to book versus movie, even though this movie is by no means like a must watch, I gave it 2.5 stars on Letterboxd, but I gave the book 2 stars. So that means when it comes to book versus movie, the movie wins. And yeah, especially if you're an animal person and you like dogs, then this movie is definitely worth watching. It's definitely worth your time. And the racing aspects, again, I thought were filmed really well. And there were so many exciting, tense, suspenseful scenes in regards to that. And yeah, it's very cheesy how it's like they were almost first place, but because they saved Arthur, they came in second. And that was so Hollywood, right? To have that be the case. Whereas in real life, they came in 12th place. But the big thing in the book is that they came in 12th place. And normally Mikhail would be obsessing over it. But the fact that he was at peace with it, being like, yeah, we didn't do amazing, but that's okay because I got Arthur. So the book I wouldn't recommend, but the movie, yeah, sure, give it a watch. It's a good time. And the dog doesn't die in the end, so you don't need to worry about that. So yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment your thoughts down below. I know in regards to some of the stuff I talked about as far as Ecuador and yeah, I know animal rights and everything, that is a controversial topic to some extent. So I'm down to debate and get into it down below in the comments, just as long as we stay respectful. You don't need to be rude. And if you are rude, I'm just gonna delete your comment anyway. So there's no point. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. And in terms of someone who was not famous, but they were thrust into the limelight, and so they wrote a book about what they experienced, I'm going to link to my video for Stronger by Jeff Bowman. He was a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing. And that is an example of a book by someone who is not a writer. And yet I loved that book so much because he is so open and vulnerable, and he does get into the details. And it's a book that I read it in one day because one, he's an amateur writer. And so the writing isn't anything intense and you can just read it very quickly. But also the way he wrote it was so compelling. And again, he was just so vulnerable. And so I just really appreciated how he really put himself into that story, into this book. And it wasn't just some surface level story, So yeah, I loved that book and movie. And so I will go ahead and link to that here if you have not watched my video on it yet. And again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.